Tonight, the Ghana Police Service is on a manhunt for 4 men who threatened to burn down the South African High Commission in Ghana in retaliation for ongoing xenophobic attacks in that country. The police say these men are armed and are dangerous to public safety. We'll be interrogating that alongside threats that have been picked up in Obuasi against Anglo Gold Ashanti's top management officers who are mainly South Africans. And also, the South African High Commissioner in Ghana is denying that any Ghanaian has been killed in connection with the xenophobic attacks there. What really are the underlying reasons for these attacks? Is it political or purely a matter of wrong perception? This is today's big story with me, Stephen Nt. Now, the Greater Accra Regional Police Command is on the lookout for 4 men who threatened to burn down the South African High Commission in Labone, a suburb of Accra. The threats follow outbreak of xenophobic violence in South Africa, where the locals say the Kweri are stealing our jobs. Kweri means pest, which is the unfortunate description given to migrant workers in that country. Now, earlier today at a news conference, the South African High Commissioner in a press conference announced a total denial that 5 Ghanaians have been killed in connection with a xenophobic attack. Let's watch her.
No Ghanaian citizen has died because of the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. 1 Ghanaian, Emmanuel Koko, died on the 7th of April in Durban. He was an epileptic patient. He had an attack in the streets of KwaMashu in Durban and died. He was taken to hospital, and a post-mortem report stated that he died of natural causes. We have also had reports of 4 Ghanaians that died in Hebron. Again, the South African High Commission, Ghanaian High Commission in South Africa, and the police have confirmed that there have been no xenophobic attacks in that area. It is currently being investigated, the cause of death, but again, it has clearly been declared that it was not from xenophobic attacks. On behalf of the South African government, we condemn, nonetheless, in the strongest possible terms, the recent outbreak of violent attacks in parts of the country against foreign nationals, particularly fellow Africans from various countries on the continent. South Africa's transition to democracy was one of the world's most iconic testimonies of tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Under the stewardship of the father of the democratic South Africa, Nelson Mandela, the country undertook an unwavering dedication to democracy, human rights, selflessness, reconciliation, service to humanity, and a better life for all. The South African government views the attacks on foreign nationals as a criminal offense that will not be tolerated. South Africa is a constitutional democracy governed by laws. Everyone working and living in the country must obey its laws in their totality. No one has the right to take the law into their own hands. The South African government will enforce the laws of the country and will not hesitate to act against criminal activity or against those found to incite violence. The South African government will also do everything in its power to ensure the safety of all citizens and foreign nationals, irrespective of their status. Similarly, Foreign nationals must meet all the legislative and regulatory requirements as prescribed by our immigration laws. South Africa is a diverse society that welcomes and promotes interaction among people of different backgrounds. As such, nothing can justify the criminal activity and intolerance that these attacks represent. Solutions can be reached through constructive engagement and by working together.
Right, we've got Dr. Kwesi Enning, a security analyst, on the telephone. But before we speak to him, let's go through some statistics that we have here in connection with what appears to be wrong perception about the number of jobs Africans hold in South Africa. Now, according to Professor Dr. Zahira Zina, who is an anthropologist and researcher at the African Center for Migration and Society of Wits University, the idea that people are stealing South African jobs and that they don't have a right to be there needs to be corrected. Now, he goes on to quote statistics from the Migrating for Work Research Consortium, which says that 82% of research they conducted last year says that 82% of the working population aged between 15 and 64 were non-migrants, and 14% were domestic migrants who had moved between provinces in the last 5 years, and just 4% could be classed as international migrant. Now, what is staggering is that with an official working population of over 33 million people, only 1.2 million of them are international migrants. So these feed into the wrong perceptions that African migrants are taking the jobs from South Africa. So, Dr. Enning, good evening and thanks for your time.
Good evening.
So, may I quickly ask you, what in your view is really the underlying reasons? Of course, we know of the Zulu King's rhetoric and some statements from South African politicians, but are these the real reasons for these xenophobic attacks?
No, probably partly, but from what I think, it's more the unstructured nature of or the unchanged nature of the South African economy, meaning that quite huge numbers of South African blacks are still poor, disenfranchised, do not feel part of the economic boom post-1990. And of course, we are seeing, supposedly migrants coming in and taking the jobs. And of course, when there are political tensions, it's easy for politicians to exploit people's frustrations, and those frustrations are then diverted towards the weak in society. And more often than not, it is poor migrants who don't have the good jobs to live in the most well-protected areas. So I think we have a panoply of reasons contributing to this. I think in the last 15 years or so, this is about the third or fourth xenophobic attack. And it's and it's continuing to get worse and to grow by the day. It's most unfortunate, particularly when these migrants are providing skills and jobs that actually employment also for South Africans. So it's most unfortunate.
Now, statistics from several research institutions, including the very recent one from the Migrating for Work Research Consortium, which is MI Work, put the figures in a very interesting way. They found out that 82% of the working population aged between 15 and 64 were non-migrants, and that just 4% could be classed as international migrants, which means that of the 33 million or so working population in South Africa, only 1.2 or so are international migrants. So these are wrong perceptions generally, which are feeding these xenophobic attacks.
I mean, perceptions do matter. During periods of tension, during periods of economic downturn, and when indigents feel that they are not getting the economic and political spin of independence. And we experienced it in Ghana in the late 60s and early 70s when we drove the Nigerians away and when they retaliated in the 80s.
Right.
So perceptions do matter, when governments are unable to fulfill their own political rhetoric in their drive to get access to political power. And I think it is that failure that feeds into other kinds of frustration that explodes into what we are seeing in South Africa right now.
Dr. Ting, I'll have you hold briefly. I've been joined on the telephone by the Greater Accra Regional Police Command, the public relations officer there, Philip Ting, is on the line to give us a brief overview of the security arrangements on the ground in connection with the South African embassy, where we heard that 4 armed men actually threatened to burn down the South African High Commission in retaliation for the attacks that are ongoing there in South Africa. Good evening, madam, and thanks for your time.
Hello, good evening.
So, what can you tell us about this manhunt for these 4? Are we looking for 4 or 5?
Thank you very much, and good evening to your listeners. It can be 4, it can be 5, it can be as many as possible. Yes, we actually know that we had information that some group of young men has now the premises of the High Commission. And as far as security is concerned, immediately we had to deploy personnel to the area to avert any kind of reprisal attack. So by the time the police arrived, they had bolted or disappeared from the scene. So it was expedient, it was necessary that the police deploy heavily security in the area to avert any kind of violence on the premises of the High Commission. Right.
So, madam, do you know exactly who you're looking for? I mean, this question is premised on the fact that I'm assuming that the police might have done its own intelligence gathering, interviewed people around the vicinity, and even interviewed the High Commissioner herself. I mean, do you know particularly who you're looking for?
No, we may not know, but I can assure you that intelligence are underway to probably have these people apprehended and had further questioning. We don't know the intention for which they went to the premises, and therefore it is too for us as a security agency and a law enforcement agency to find out who they are, what their intentions were, probably what they have gone there to do.
Right. So it also means that you won't be able to establish the nationalities of these people because, I mean, this is happening in South Africa, and anybody, I mean, from Nigeria, Guinea, Malawi, anyone in the African sub-region who could be affected and is living in Ghana could be.
Exactly so.
So that's it. You're not looking at only Ghanaians.
No.
Okay.
For now, I'm not saying Ghanaians. Members of the general public.
Okay, that's fair. Now, what is the extent of security operation to protect the High Commission? Are you able to give us an overview of things you're doing to protect the High Commission?
Yes, whatever we have on paper is the security information.
Okay.
And we have a number of plans or security arrangements that have been devised. And as and when it is necessary, we are going to implement them. So for now, we have enough security arrangements, adequate security arrangements in place to ensure that all South African countries, South African nationals in the country are protected, and also to maintain the interest or the diplomatic relations between the two countries.
Right, Madam Ting, your line is fading out. I'm not sure where you're standing, but if you could reposition yourself, then we'll ask you a few.
Is it okay?
Yes, I'm okay now. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Now, I want to get a fair idea. I know that our intelligence we've gathered on the ground around Labone and surrounding vicinities suggests that the residents are wondering why the excessive security in their neighborhood, seeing that most of them do not think that they are violent, that they do not have any plans of mounting revenge attacks on the High Commission. So possibly the excess security there is not necessary. Are you able to give us any assurances or guarantees that this is not actually targeted towards protecting the embassy or High Commission against residents?
Yes, all the residents will rest assured that whatever security arrangements we have devised and implementing it as and when is necessary for the protection and security of embassy and even to the people who are close by. Because if something, if any violence is suspected or if any violence goes up in the British or even the person, the possibility of it extending it to these residents is possible. So
right.
we would assure them that this should take home and that the security is targeted at the benefit of the High Commission and not the.
Right, Madam Tenge, we're grateful for your time. Thank you very much. Ifya Tenge is ASP. Ifya Tenge is the Public Relations Officer for the Greater Accra Region Police Command. Thanks very much. Dr. Kwesi Henning, security analyst, is still on the line. Dr. Henning, we were talking about where this possibly could be coming from, and you've made mention of the fact that in times like these, statistics really makes less difference in the sense that when people are agitated, they're not looking at how many jobs are being lost or how many jobs are going away. I need to get a fair analysis from yourself whether you feel that when it comes to the security of African nationals who live in South Africa, the sub-region, ECOWAS, the African Union, AU, and the other African countries have used the right approaches to resolve the matter. Dr. Henning?
Yes.
I'm asking whether you feel that African nations, including Ghana really, and the sub-regional body, ECOWAS and African Union, have used the right approaches to resolve the matter and ensure that this xenophobia comes to an end quick enough.
Well, I think that, xenophobia is not an issue that I remember the African Union or ECOWAS really has put on the agenda. But I think in a globalizing Africa with growing economies, of course, with serious disparities, these things will continue to grow. I mean, we've experienced it in West Africa, we've experienced it elsewhere. But I think, yeah, if it's been an oversight, probably it's time that this is put on the agenda. ECOWAS will be meeting sometime around the ending of May. And I think it's important and critical that this becomes one of the agenda issues. It does not, xenophobic attacks don't give a great impression of our drive for an African Union or of an African resurgence. I think it just shows the age-old animosities and hatreds that are still coming to the fore, and that does not augur well for our development and stability process.
Now, talking about that, there have been calls for some form of diplomatic strings. I mean, for example, Malawi is sending away the High Commissioner in their country, the South African High Commissioner in their country, and there have been calls from AFAC, a civil society group, that Ghana should do same, send away the South African High Commissioner to Ghana and some key South African government officials in the country as a strong warning that we are not happy with what's happening in South Africa. Is this a rope that you feel Ghana should tow?
Absolutely not. I think the South African High Commissioner has been called to the Foreign Ministry. Ghana, the Ghanaian government, has made its objections extremely clear in the strongest possible diplomatic terms. And I think as a leader in Pan-Africanism and leading the drive towards independence and a resurgent Africa, I think Ghana's role here is about tempering people's anger and emotional frustrations and channeling those into saying dialogue, reconciliation, and negotiations are the best way out of it. That Africa grows stronger and South Africa learns when we help South Africa to recognize that, the best way to playing that lead role is having that ability to absorb different people who come into that country. A strong, functional South Africa is good and it's great for the project or for the African Union project. So an aggressive retaliatory policy of sending the High Commissioner away and of closing South African businesses will not actually douse the flames in South Africa. It will actually worsen it, and that is not what we are looking for right now.
Talking about South African businesses, I'm coming back to the point where many Ghanaians have suggested that we should, for example, close down South African businesses. ShopRite, for example, MTN is one, that if we either protest in stopping or stop patronizing their services and products, it could be an enough warning. But is this prudent to consider, even in Ghana, considering our economic standing compared to that of South Africa?
No, I don't think so. I mean, my point is very clear. Having called the South African High Commissioner into the Foreign Ministry for a chat and for a dressing down, I think that is how far we should go. If we have any more concern, it should be a collective ECOWAS AU response. And I think the African Union Chairperson Zuma has issued a strongly worded statement cautioning the South African government to do all that is possible. And I think in diplomatic speak, the South African government understands what is happening. It cannot be ostracized on this continent because it is treating the countries and the citizens whose sweat and sacrifices made their independence in 1990 possible. This is a major embarrassment to the South African government. What we should be doing is not to embarrass them further, but to say, we are watching you, but this is not acceptable. You can't treat our people this way. You've got to get your act together. And I think the South African government has heard Africa's concerns very loud and very clear.
Right. Dr. Ene, we'll hold you briefly and return to the South African High Commissioner's press conference earlier today. She actually suggested or made mention of a couple of things her government is doing to resolve the matter. Let's watch.
President Zuma has also assigned ministers of Home Affairs, Mr. Malusi Gigaba, Minister of Police, Honorable Nathi Nhleko, and Minister for State Security, Honorable David Mahlobo, to stop the violence that has broken out in parts of the country, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. In the KwaZulu-Natal province, and especially around Durban residential areas. This includes the establishment of an interdepartmental task team to coordinate the response. Additional law enforcement officers have been deployed from around the country, and they have been deployed to the affected areas to reinforce law and order and prevent further attacks. Thus far, a number of suspects have been arrested. All district disaster management centers have been placed on high alert. A 24-hour call center has been established and remains accessible in the event of further attacks or threats of this nature occurring in future. Shelters have been set up to accommodate displaced foreign nationals, and basic amenities such as water, sanitation, and health care have been provided. The South African government is working closely with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, International Organization for Migration, IOM, as well as non-governmental organizations to provide food, psychosocial, and other support to those affected. Community engagements are being conducted through the Communities in Dialogue program, community safety forums, ward committees, and through community development workers, amongst others. Starting from today, throughout the week, President Zuma has deployed all cabinet ministers and deputy ministers on the ground in all provinces and has tasked them to ensure that the situation in the affected communities is returned to normal.
Right, Dr. Ene, I'm not sure you heard the High Commissioner clearly, but in some, I mean, what she's saying is telling us is what her government is doing to ensure the situation returns to normal. You think that's enough? I mean, reinforcing security, setting up settlement camps for non-migrants, are these enough?
Well, I mean, these are ad hoc measures to stem the worst aspects of the tide. You know, but in terms of, you know, even short to medium term, there's got to be some transformation in relations. The public discourse and the rhetoric about migrants must shift and change much more in ways. And of course, the economy must create much more, many more jobs for ordinary South Africans. I mean, we can protect migrants as much as possible, and there's been a limit to how much the government can do that. You know, so these are short-term, very cosmetic measures, and they do not really tackle the deep structural, you know, deformations in the South African society.
So, I mean, you earlier when I spoke to you, you made mention of the fact that these xenophobic attacks will not go away because there is a structural problem with Southern Africa. Is it a political problem where, for example, the political rhetoric has always been that the foreigners are taking our jobs? The Zulu king said that we don't want them, send them away, pack your bags and leave. Do you feel that looking at the rhetoric, and looking at the structure of South Africa's economy, considering what they've gone through in the apartheid system, this xenophobic attacks will raise its ugly head now and then in that society and would never go away?
Well, one can never say never, but it will stay in South Africa for a very long time to come, because the very nature of the political discourse and the structure of the economy means that the wealth is actually still going to a very exclusive group. And quite a number of the highly educated foreigners who are needed by the South African economy to grow will be protected. The economy is a magnet, it's the second biggest in Africa, if not the biggest. So to still attract people to go there, it's important and it's imperative for South African politicians to know that words have power. And when words are translated into action, and particularly when it's the type that mobilizes and distorts the reality of ordinary people, then those words can turn into violence, and that is what we are seeing.
And that's what.
And I think there's got to be a manner in which, you know, those words can also be criminalized, so that those who incite this type of violence can be punished.
What about, Dr. Ting, what about those who tend to blame Mandela for not putting in place the right structures? I mean, since he became the first black South African to be president, there were those blacks, majority blacks, who expected that he will tweak the system in a way to favor blacks more, but that didn't happen, although a few of the ANC top officials went on to become millionaires after his reign. What do you say about
well,
these?
I mean, the structure was in place. There was very little Mandela could do. Mandela was a transitional figure, and I think his main role was to ensure that he could control the violence that had been pent up over centuries, and the violence that had deliberately been encouraged during the liberation movement of targeting those who were perceived to be wealthy. I mean, the Black economic empowerment program has not been that successful. As you correctly say, it's favored an exclusive elite who have become super rich, while the majority, I mean, if you go to the township, it's horrendous. I mean, traveling from Cape Town Airport into Cape Town itself, I mean, you pass Kailicha, and I mean, you can't build public toilets in public where, you know, there are almost no coverings, and people can see you do the most private of your business. You know, so the government has not been able to transform the optimism and the hope of an independent, black-led, democratic South Africa into economic gain for most of the people. That is where the problem lies. I don't think it lies with Mr. Mandela. He fulfilled his role of ensuring that at least black and white could live and work together and control the pent-up violence that could have exploded at any one time.
Right, Dr. Ting, we're grateful as always for your time on today's big story. Dr. Ting is a security analyst, and my name is Stephen Nt. Thanks to you for making time with us on today's big story. We'll be right back with Joy News Interactive.